Let's continue animating on the ball. In the last video, we animated the Y position. Now we're going to add some squash and stretch. Squash and stretch is a principle of animation that's going to give our ball a more organic look. To add the squash and stretch, we're going to be using scale keys. Let's start by ensuring we're at the beginning of the timeline, and then we can select the ball group and set our initial scale using the inspector. So we'll key the X and Y scale. You can see that both of those properties have been added to our timeline. Now that we have our initial scale keyed, we need to determine where we want to add our first bit of action. And that, I think, is going to be when the ball comes in contact with the ground. For this, we'll be doing a squash, which means we're going to expand the X and shrink the Y. In the previous video, we moved the origin of the ball group to the base of the ball so that we could have the origin of the change happen from the ground. The position of your origin is something that you should be thinking about every time you set up a rig so that you know that you're making changes from the right location. Let's go ahead and squash this ball. So let's add a value of 120% on the X and 80 on the Y. We've adjusted our scale by 20% in both directions so that we can keep the overall volume of the ball the same. We'll be doing the same thing once we stretch the ball out vertically because, again, we always want to maintain the same volume. If we check our interpolation, starting from the beginning, you'll see that the squash isn't going to work right. The problem is that our squashing is happening from the very first key, and we actually want it to start when it comes in contact with the ground, not as it's falling towards the ground. So for right now, we can fix this by adding a few more keys right about here that'll keep our ball at the original scale, so 100% scale on the X and 100% on the Y. And now we're going to maintain that original scale until the ball comes in contact with the ground, where it will instantly squash down. Now we can actually squash the ball out a bit more so that it continues to squash as it's coming to contact with the ground, which is going to make it look a little bit better. So let's go over to this frame here and stretch it a bit more. And again, we want to shrink the Y as much as we did the X. Now, if we pan that motion back and forth, you're going to see that we come in contact with the ground, smash down, and then continue to smash as the ball stays in contact. After we get done with the squashing motion, we need to return our ellipse back to 100% or start working that way. So we can put a key one frame after our squash and set it back to 100%. And then make sure that at the end of the animation, we're at 100% as well. Currently, the way we have it set up is that it'll stay at 100% until it hits the ground where it squashes, and then goes back to 100% and stays that way until the animation finishes. So you can see how that looks, and it's already looking a lot better. We're seeing the impact of the ground, but we need to start actually making the ball stretch to give it some type of speed. Thankfully, we've already set a key. So the keys that we set at 100% that are next to the squash, we can use those and just replace the values. So we can go to like 80 and 120% on the Y, which is going to give it a nice speed effect. If we look at what we have now, you can see that we're starting at 100% and then we're stretching out to give that sense of speed until we hit the ground, which at that point will squash down. So we can see that in real time, and you can see that the beginning is starting to look good, but we need to probably change the interpolation here a little bit. So we can select those scale keys and match the curve that we have at the beginning. Now we could try to match that curve manually, or what we can do is select our Y position key and use these numerical values down here below the curve and use Command C and then go back to our scale keys and go back to the number value and then paste it there. And you'll notice that when we hit enter, we have the same curve that we had before. And if we preview that, you can see that the interpolation is working a lot better. Now let's do the same on the other side of our squashing. So we can go to these 100% keys and use the exact same values. And in fact, we can just copy and paste those values over. So now we're stretching and then squashing. And then when it comes off the ground, it's going to stretch again and then go back to 100%.